Progress report, which I'm sure Andy Mead will be presenting to us. You have any slides or anything, Andy, to start with, or just questions?
So no slides. I was just going to touch on the key points, which are on page 137 of the agenda, and then we can, if you like, we can just work through the table page by page as we normally do, if that works for everyone. So I think the key points in this update, firstly, is that our three plan changes, so housing choice, flooding and earthworks, they remain on track, which I'm happy to say, for notification at the October UFTED committee meeting, so your next meeting. And of course we'll update if anything changes there, but they are on track at the moment. So is the Te Papa Spatial Plan for adoption in October, and at the end of this meeting there is a workshop session on that plan. In terms of the Local Government Commission, it has confirmed the transfer of land from Western Bay to TCC for the Tauranga West Urban Growth Area, and they are in the middle of their submission process for the other three areas. So there was an elected member question around TCC's current land area and how that might change if these four areas were transferred into the city. So the current land area is 135 square kilometres, 175 if you include the waterways like the harbour. That will increase by approximately 6.6 square kilometres, or by about 5%. There may have been a typo in that council catch-up, which I apologise for. So in terms of the Tauranga Northern Link, we know that that project is moving at pace. That is a transport project, but linked heavily to the Smiths Farm Special Housing Area, which is TCC owned. And the key update there is that we need to move towards signing and agreeing a memorandum of understanding with NZTA, either this month or next month, in relation to cost sharing for the access road and the shared stormwater solution and services. So a separate report will be brought to you on those matters, probably at the next UFTED committee meeting. The way we're looking at that is that will not commit us to co-funding that infrastructure, but it will be provided as a discretionary item in the tender for the TNL, so that we can have a good look at the cost of that project before committing. The commitment would probably need to be made early next calendar year. You've probably all seen the independent report that has been released on the government's review of the resource management system, which is quite voluminous, quite significant, and suggesting some quite significant change. So this is not a government position, it's an independent position at this point, which the new government, however that is made up, will consider and provide its view on in a forward process following the upcoming central government elections. The changes that are proposed are quite substantive. We would no longer have a standalone district plan, city plan. It would be one single district plan and regional plan for the whole of the Bay of Plenty region that we would contribute to, along with all of the other councils. Of course, that is potentially subject to change as the process evolves. It provides at this stage significant uncertainty around the city plan review project, as legislation would most probably be passed and enacted ahead of our city plan review being notified. So at this stage there's not much we can do to resolve that uncertainty, but we need to continue engaging with officials and ministers on this matter as things continue. There's a question there.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, so it might be a bit premature and you might need to come back to answer this question, but in terms of the Strategic Planning Act that they're proposing, or is our planning team, in favour of it overall, or is the uncertainty it causes outweighing the benefits, or you haven't formed an opinion yet?
So 3 acts are proposed, 3 new acts to replace the RMA. One is around effectively environmental and urban planning. One is a Strategic Planning Act, which would mandate spatial planning at a regional level. And the third is a climate change based act, largely around probably future managed retreat from areas of sea level rise, etc. At this stage, we haven't spent a significant amount of time going through those recommendations. Probably don't see the value of that until we understand the government position. But obviously, we do support very much sub-regional, regional, and Upper North Island spatial planning. So very keen on that aspect of it. I think there might have been another question on this topic.
Yeah, just so in future then doing our own plan changes, does that mean that we wouldn't be doing our own? Does that lessen the ability of your team to create plan changes going forward, and that it happens at a regional level? And what does that mean for amalgamation of our teams or work going forward?
Those are all very good questions and ones we don't have answers to at this stage. It would be hard to see how there wouldn't remain a process for plan changes to continue. Whether they would be considered at a council level or a regional level, I'm unsure. The recommendation is to set up effectively a regional committee. So it would be made up of elected members from all of the Bay of Plenty councils. We would have representation on that, and that would create a plan, and no doubt it would be involved in amendment of plans between the plan-making processes. But at this stage, nothing has changed in terms of our ability to process plan changes or for private plan changes to be considered by the council.
Just, I'll come to John next, but just a question. After the election, there will be obviously a little bit more certainty, but not complete. But councils have different times for their plan change reviews, and we're close to this. Would there be an opportunity, do you think, it's hypothetical of course, but would there be an opportunity maybe we could just get an extension to our review if they're going to go through this process, because otherwise we're going to do a lot of work that's just not going to be working into the new plan? Yeah,
I'd say that at the moment there's quite significant misalignment with, say, the national planning standards and the timeframes that puts around councils having to review their district and regional plans versus the idea of creating new regional-based planning instruments. So that's a matter that is certainly going to have to be considered by the government. I suspect there will have to be some provisions there. I think in terms of the work we're doing at the moment for the city plan review, whether that feeds into the city plan review or it feeds into a separate process to create a different type of plan, the work is still going to have value. The question will be, once we get 2 or 3 years down the line and we're actually talking about notification and submissions and stuff, that's where we've got to be careful about duplicating effort.
Councillor Robson?
Yeah, just, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but the discussion around the review of the RMA and the different levels looking at it and this move to regional, that's obviously something that's been picked up by Infrastructure New Zealand. They've got very much a regional framework going. But one of the criticisms, and I'm interested in your response to the criticism, one of the criticisms is that until the government of this country has a structure plan for the country, then what everyone else does is subject to enormous change. When you have no one knowing where the ports are going to be in 10, 20, 30 years' time, when you have Christchurch deciding they might dump a new international airport down the road without telling anyone they're buying the land for that reason. Do you have any comment on the fact that we sort of start this bottom-up thing which runs into central government, now people are looking at a regional thing which runs into central government, but central government don't seem to have recognise the need for them to have a plan at the top. Any comment, or is that for next year?
I think it probably stems from the fact that we don't have an overall population strategy for New Zealand, so there are probably some gaps at that central level around some of those key things like ports, Tauranga with or without a port. would be a completely different kettle of fish to manage. But obviously our port is hugely successful, and we want to continue to foster that success, and that's what we're planning for at the moment. So there are some gaps there, but there's always going to be gaps, I suspect, at different levels.
Happy to move, Chair.
Last two there. Andy, G and
Yes,
H,
sure.
anything further there?
Yep. So the government has obviously released it and confirmed its national policy statement for urban development, and we have a presentation to run through on that today. And I'm not sure the best time to run through that. Maybe after we've gone through the table, we could run through it at the end and just leave that item just sitting on the table till the end. It's a pretty short, sort of 10 or 12 slides around just key issues there. Probably the key things to note is that it is largely consistent with the work we are undertaking at the moment around intensification. We've also had the government finalise its national policy statement and national environmental standard around freshwater management. We made some quite extensive submissions which support in principle the direction of those around creating healthy waterways moving forward, but also noting the various challenges that could be created if it was too prescriptive in terms of providing for urban development. There has been quite significant change between the draft documentation and the final documentation. Many of the issues that we've raised have been addressed. For example, in the initial documentation, really only nationally significant infrastructure was provided for in and around streams and wetlands. Now there's provision for regional strategic infrastructure as defined in the in regional plans, which covers the majority of infrastructure that we provide, including lifelines infrastructure. There are still some outstanding issues where there's some uncertainty around the relocation of streams, which might be required in areas like Tauranga West, so not filling them in and getting rid of them or piping them, but relocating them. And also around a new definition of wetlands, which is more prescriptive than what we have in the regional plan at the moment. So at the regional plan at the moment, any type of wet type pasture is excluded from being a wetland. Now it's only excluded if it contains at least 50% of or less than 50% of exotic kind of wetland kind of growing reeds and plants and things like that. So we need to consider what that means for Tauranga West and also for Te Tumu. Additional areas may well be classified as wetland. They are very strongly protected. Basically, it's a prohibition on touching them. So that further work is going to get underway in the next sort of month or so, but it's one of the key work streams around finalising the structure planning for those two growth areas. And I just want to pick up just finally around the Keenan Road and Tauranga Business Estate extension areas. So those are areas that the Local Government Commission are looking at, as you're aware. They're also, going back to 2016 and decisions made by Smart Growth and then by this council, or the previous versions of this council, I should say, were to agree to the future structure planning and zoning of those areas, and we're still working as staff to those recommendations. We would commence structure planning of Keenan Road once the boundary change had been completed, if it does proceed, with the view of zoning that through the city plan review. And in terms of the Tauranga Business Estate, there is sort of the same process, or perhaps the majority landowner there, who is the developer of the business estate, may wish to progress something themselves in terms of a consenting or plan change process. So I just wanted to bring that back to your attention as well. But that's all from me.
Just So just questions on those points Andy's raised, and then we'll go to the general report. Councillor Robson and then Councillor Clout.
Yeah, through the chair, but possibly to the chief executive more than to
Question for you, Chief
to
Executive.
Andy. With regard to the MPS on urban development, it's going to have an impact at local level. The ability to do things increasingly, I think elected members are already, certainly in my experience, coming across situations where neighbours are not happy with what neighbours are able to do. In some of those conversations, I'm explaining to people that, hey, you know, those private land rights you so treasure, your neighbours exercising them, the government's encouraging them to exercise them. Is there been any thought done at Solgan or any other level about the resource implications of dealing with the community pushback against the NPS on urban development in terms of both communications requirement at local level so people understand what's coming down the track legislatively, and also from an internal resourcing perspective to deal with, I think, a significant amount of challenge and pushback that I think large parts of our community are going to engage in, particularly those people who feel they're losing something. Those people that are gaining, of course, are happy.
The answer is no, there hasn't.
Supplementary, do you think we need to address that, or do we think we should just ignore it?
Look, I think it's something that we can take into consideration. I guess we don't know what we don't know until this bites and the community either support or rise up. The changes. That's right.
I could just add to that. Sorry, I mean, this will be a key part of our engagement and communications process around once we go to notify our plan change and once we've completed the Te Papa spatial plan. So we plan to get that word out there as much as we possibly can, that a lot of what we are progressing is something that is mandated, is something we have to do by the government.
Yeah, it's probably no consolation, but we're in the same boat as every other council across the country. So, yeah.
Just supplementary to that, Andy, you've said that we will be the first council to implement or incorporate the NPS in regard to the parking requirements in October. Is that right? Or at least when we notify, or is that when it takes effect?
Yes, so the notification of the housing will be in October. We should be, if not one of the first councils to look to comply fully with the NPSUD around that. In terms of car parking, that's run not through a plan change process, but a separate process where we can just make those changes to the plan. And I understand, looking at Janine, that we're looking to do that in November this year. Yeah.
That is going to come fast.
Correct.
And may have the kind of reaction that Councillor Robson is referring to. Councillor Carl, yeah, you got a comment? Councillor Clout, then Councillor.
Yeah, thank you. I noticed that the COVID-19 Recovery Fast Track Consenting Act came into effect on the 9th of July. So have we had any landowners or developers coming to us wanting to enact this sort of fast tracking consenting process, or is this something that has not had great pickup?
At this stage, we have not had anyone that has approached us. We're aware of at least one application that's been considered. And I think, as we mentioned at one of our previous committee meetings, we are also considering whether it would have any value to any of the projects we're looking to progress, such as out in Tauranga West. So we're still working on that.
Councillor Kitty?
Just regarding what Carl was saying, are we looking at what the other councils are doing or the communications that they're looking at putting out? Are we engaging with them to make this process a lot easier? And to ensure that we're probably all singing from the same song sheet.
I'll just hand that over to Janine.
So from a local level, we now have monthly meetings with Regional Council and Western Bay, and it is top on the agenda to discuss with them on Friday this week about how we're implementing the NPSUD through the various councils, well, the 3 councils, and our timing of that, because that's quite an important consideration. So I can raise that kind of combined or one story in terms of that communications with them at that point.
Yeah, that's great, thank you.
All right, moving on to the progress updates for this quarter. If we can go through that page by page, don't feel you have to ask lots of questions. Well, we kind of hadn't, but you did, that's fine. Just on plan change, on the 3 plan changes, Andy, are there any significant changes that have been made as a result of the consultation that we need to be brought up to speed with before the October meeting? And if so, how will we go about that? Will we have a workshop, a briefing or something?
Janine, can you address that one?
So in terms of the feedback, we didn't have any significant changes that were requested. As we've discussed with you, we've had a couple of follow-up workshops with some of those key stakeholders, and that was more to work around some of the detail. What we are trying to work with governance at the moment is to organise a 2-hour drop-in session for councillors to come and ask any questions. So our approach at this stage is we're trying to get the draft provisions in Section 32 finalised well in advance of the October meeting. These are really substantial documents, just a heads up. And we want to give you enough time to be able to read through those documents and fully understand, and then provide a drop-in session for you to ask any questions in relation to the 3 plan changes.
Thank you. And just following on from that, given that this is a massive step forward for us to be notifying, 3 plan changes, but in particular the Te Papa housing choice one, I wonder if we could have a bit of a celebration on that day, assuming that the committee decides to pass it. But there are people that have been involved in this outside of us, people that we've consulted with and so on. I just wonder, I was just having a brief conversation with the Chief Executive, if we could give thought to perhaps hosting an afternoon tea or something, and having, it's pretty big. We've been pushing for this for years and you've been working very hard on it. Might be worthy of celebration in some way, and including a lot more people in it if we could. Thoughts on that? Okay. But less than 100 if we're still at level 2.
Yeah,
Very good.
We'll organise that through the fund committee.
Other questions then? We'll go by page. We're at 140, page 140, flipping over to page 141. These are all the plan changes. Not seeing any hands going up, so we're at page 143. Tauranga West, urban growth area. Any questions there? 144, 145. It's on that page that we talk about possibly utilising the fast-tracking consenting process ourselves. That's what you raised, Councillor Clout. Page 146, Keenan Road and the increased land to our boundary. We will still be the 4th smallest territorial authority in the country by land area, even after this is added to us, I think.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. Just going back to page, I think it was 144. I've lost it. But I take it the implications of Te Tumu and the opening up of that land tract, as in fact we talked about this morning, relies on that interchange, and that will be a part of the funding requirements of this, the Papamoa East, the PEI.
So, opening up to Tumu requires the Papamoa East interchange to be constructed. That is correct.
My point is, I think it would be great to see it expressed overtly. I think there's because we're missing it today. Going forward, every other day is going to be more of a miss. And I'd hate to think that we get on with this, but where that's not front and centre, in fact, ahead of really any of the work, I would have thought. I may be wrong, happy to be challenged on that.
So yes, it will be, and it will be an absolute key part of the LTP, and one of I'm just working on is a report that's coming to the policy committee to talk about the LTP and how we're going to present different scenarios, and scenarios which have all of the funding required to deliver on the urban form and transport initiatives, which includes opening up Te Tumu and all of the roading and the community infrastructure required to make that successful in terms of places for people to live.
In an ideal world, because some concurrency would be great, would it not? If Te Tumu was being opened up via the boulevard, that currently piece of dirt road, at the same time as the Papamoa East interchange was being developed. But what would worry me about that, I mean, it would be great so that arrives at the same time in space. What would worry me is we end up with a B2B that's never ending, But just a thought on work sequencing is really what I'm talking about here more than anything.
Yeah, the issue is really the challenges around the funding. So we've done quite a lot of work around the sequencing, about the timelines it would take, and we're actively working in terms of the planning, Papamoa East Interchange. So we're driving forward on that, on the assumption that a funding arrangement will be put in place. So we're not slowing down on the planning. We've learned from the past that the last thing you want to do is turn the planning tap off, because then when funding does it, so that's driving forward. And we understand how long it's going to take. I think from memory, nearly 4 years from if you were to say we're going to the day that a car can drive on it and a bus can drive on it is 4 years. So we've got all of that mapped out. It's around now securing the funding.
Just further to that, I wonder whether there is an opportunity, whilst there's a crew out there doing Rangiuru, to think about doing two at once. So that's the way we should be thinking.
Hughes?
Has there been any more discussion? I know you're talking to Hamilton about Tauranga West and the possibility of there being a minimum housing density out there. Has that gone further forward?
Yeah, so we're working with Hamilton City Council on a joint, consultant report dealing with their greenfield areas, our greenfield areas, and housing choice and minimum densities. We have received a draft report, and we're just working that through with the consultants at the moment. There's going to have to be some amendment and change to that, but once that report is in a more of a final draft or completed form, we will be bringing it back around this table for discussion around what the the recommendations and implications are of it.
Thank you.
Is that likely to be October 13 or November 24 or next year?
Janine?
It's more likely to be the November after the committee.
So moving on through our pages, 147, the rural land study. Any questions there?
Sorry, can I just ask a supplementary on that then? In terms of our decision around whether we would fast track anything out that way, we would have that information first?
Absolutely, yes.
48. Some of these have been covered off in reports or in briefings. 149. Going through the NPS statements we've discussed. Urban Development Bill. 151. 152. The flooding hazards. It has to be a concern, Andy, in there that approximately 25 of those identify the need for consideration long-term retreat. The more we look into this, meeting the requirement of the regional council's requirement for the high level of this mitigation or dealing with the resilience, we're just losing more and more land, aren't we? Any comment?
I think the only comment is that is an active issue that we, we've seemingly found a pathway through in terms of our current plan changes, but a matter that we need to continue to engage with them on before we can progress and notify our city plan review. Yep, it still remains a significant issue.
Councillor Hollis?
Sorry, does that mean that we're pushing back against RCP 8.5?
We can't necessarily push back against those components because a lot of the sea level rise that we need to plan for is set in MFE guidelines. already, and the MFE guidelines actually, in some instances, set a higher standard than what's currently in the regional policy statement. So there are other parts of the regional policy statement that set some pretty high bars around other hazards, which we're still in discussion with, but the sea level rise one is one that's set at a national level.
And that's set in stone, so it's not really a guideline.
It is a guideline, MFE guidelines, that set how we should plan going forward. Very much the Regional Council is looking to align their policy now and in the future with those guidelines. And that's pretty much the approach that's been taken across other jurisdictions in the country.
Mr Robson, then Councillor Hughes.
Yeah, picking up the point you've just made, Chair, and perhaps through to the Mayor, in your conversations with ministers over the past few months, do they get that squeeze between RPS and what NPSUD, do they get that squeeze we're starting to face with constraints on the environmental side and all the other resilience issues? Are they across that, do you think? Or their staff, I'm sure, are, but are the ministers across it, do you feel?
Happy to answer that, Chair. Yeah, they do. We have talked about it, and often we've talked about the conflict between it. I think that opportunities exist to change that through initiatives of this sort, through initiatives like smart growth particularly, and initiatives that I see as a subset of it really, what we're talking about here, to change that so there is a more alignment of policy statements between the territorial authorities, the regional authorities and the government, because as you're quite rightly pointing out, John, the misalignment is creating not only confusion but great difficulties in taking things forward effectively. But I do believe they recognise and understand that.
I think it's one of the values of having ministers sitting at the smart growth table very soon, which will enable us all to address it. Councillor Hughes, question?
Yeah, just around, I mean, there's probably going to be more constraints around greenfields, land development in these policy statements. So how are we looking at have we got any enabling possibilities for what we're doing in brownfields apart from our plan changes, something like a Panuku project type organisation that would start to try and actually join together some thinking around better intensification outcomes faster to mitigate some of those?
Yeah, I'll just start on that. So not looking so much at the Panuku idea, but what happens next around intensification from a planning perspective, and we will be bringing a report on this probably to this committee in November, and that's looking at doing something similar to what we've done for Te Papa, but across those broader Otamotai and Mount Maunganui suburbs as well, and looking at whether there are any further, I guess, initiatives or areas that are suitable for greater intensification than what we're providing for in the plan change. So, high-level apartment buildings and things like that. So that's where that's going. There are some actions coming out of the Te Papa and UFTI to look at some of those broader initiatives around things like a structure like a Panuku, but also there's opportunities that sit there where we need to contribute, but we're not really leading, particularly around Pukahinahina and the accessible properties, working with Kāinga Ora to unlock development capacity there, and also in Maryvale. Christine may have some further comments to add.
I was going to say much similar to Andy in terms of working with MHUD Kāinga Ora. The other piece of thinking that we've been doing is how do we make sure that TCC is coordinating all its elements in terms of the contribution to delivery to Papa, that we don't just effectively zone it, create a spatial plan and walk away. So what does that look like in terms of resourcing and delivery? And so we'll probably bring a paper as part of the LTP issues and options to say, here's how you could do that. Here are a range of scenarios. They'll all have resourcing implications, so we're currently not resourced to do that. What does that look like and how high do you want to pitch that? So really more coming from how do we as a council make sure we coordinate and aligned and able to ensure that we drive into implementation.
Thank you.
Councillor Robson?
It's a slightly pedantic point, but it's important to me, so I'll raise it. And important, I think, in terms of discussing with other people. I have in the family, by de facto marriage, a planner, someone who runs their own business. And when we talk about brownfield, my understanding in urban planning, brownfield is land that was previously developed but is no longer in use. Quite often it's been contaminated, or it's through industrial decline or something like that. If that's an accepted definition of brownfield in urban planning circles, do we have any brownfield in Tauranga, as opposed to land that's in use but we'd like to change its use or intensify its use or whatever? Do we have any brownfield in Tauranga?
So the way you characterise it, I think, is generally correct, the way that it would be seen. So brownfield sites are often large, previously industrial type sites. So up in Auckland there were the tank farms on the waterfront, or the big quarry that was redeveloped by Fletcher's. No, we don't really have those sites, or at least not at this point in time in the city. So our intensification is largely intensifying our suburbs and those commercial centres around and within those suburbs.
Can I just
Councillor
clarify then?
Hughes?
I've had that definition wrong. I thought brownfields was just opposed to greenfields being all. Good to know.
The correct term for, I guess, intensification is grey fields. So, yeah, there you go.
Okay, well, that takes us through that quarterly report. I think all the questions are finished. We can go to a motion. I think the Mayor has indicated he would move, seconded by Councillor Clout. Mayor Temby, you wish to speak to it?
Thank you for that, Chair. Look, I'm pretty excited about this. Tauranga, I believe, tends to operate in well-intentioned but often very disconnected silos, and this is an opportunity to change that. So I welcome the more strategic and integrated approach and thank the staff for all the work they've done on this so far. I think it's testimony to the work that we need to do in collaboration and partnership with our regional partners, with iwi, with special interest groups, and most particularly with central government. This is where this is all leading, as indeed it did, I think, quite quickly with smart growth. And there is no doubt that with a process of this sort, we must engage openly, transparently and effectively with the community. We run a huge risk of, if we don't communicate effectively, of this going off track and being skewed. And I really hope we have an ability to do exactly that with this process, because there is no doubt in my mind that the opportunity for the city going forward is really quite profound through integrated strategic processes of this sort. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mayor. The seconder. Other speakers? Councillor Robson.
It's an and statement, not an or statement. It's not in contradiction to what the Mayor said, because I agree with him. However, we do need to take the community with us, and we do need to understand the needs that the community have, and I think it's getting those two things right and getting that balance right. I think sometimes we're too much in the community silo occasionally, not often, and sometimes we're too much in the central government silo, but we need both left and right sides to be working together to make this actually work. I think that's critical.
Thank you. Any other speakers? Councillor Arbery.
Yeah, I'll send a request through Democracy Services as well, but I'm keen just to get into the $900 million risk projects and how you're choosing to prioritise those. I'm quite keen to understand that better, and might need to have a catch up with someone later on.
I'm super excited about the day on October the 13th for the notification of the plan changes, particularly the housing choice one to the Papa spatial plan. That may be evident because of my calling for a party. But after this meeting, we are going to an open workshop too on the implementation plan. And look, as I read that through prior to this meeting, I am super encouraged with where we're heading and what this peninsula is going to look like. It may be in 10, 15, 20 years. I'm lucky to be a resident at the tail end of it, but as you go through this implementation plan, which we'll cover more after the meeting, this is going to be a great place to live. People are going to want to be living in apartments alongside the Cameron Road corridor and other corridors that are developed. The amenity in this area that's in the initial stages of that planning now is fantastic for the city, and I think it'll be a great day when we move forward into the notification of that plan. I agree with Councillor Arbery that the 900 million is eye-watering in terms of what we're looking at with mitigation of some of that hazard risk, and we will need to keep our eye on that as we go forward, but that's in the LTP. So thank you. Back to you, Mayor, for a right of reply if you wish. If not, I'll put that. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you very much. What? Oh, the presentation. Sorry, before we close the meeting. Okay, it's part of this, is it? Or part of the workshop? Part of this. Okay. So we'll go to this last presentation. There's no resolutions with this, are there? No. Okay.
I think we can whip through this pretty quickly. So this is just a little bit more detail on the MPS urban development, and Carl's just going to help me run through some of it. Why is it not changing slides? What have I done, Carl? Did I turn this off? I may need a little bit of help. That's strange. Okay. I think we're good now. Okay, not sure what I did there. So just this is an update. More generally, quite a lot of national policy statement and national direction happening. So that's just what's happening there at the either the next UFD committee, or depending if that's full, because there's quite a lot of items at the one beyond that, we will give an update around the freshwater management. By that stage, we should have a better understanding of what it means, particularly in our greenfield areas. And then next year, we've got Indigenous biodiversity and highly productive land, national direction to land. And again, that starts to bring up some of these issues that are around the various directions starting to conflict with each other or making things quite difficult. You've got productive land trying to push us away from the good horticulture kiwifruit land, and then you've got freshwater saying, well, in some of those less highly productive land where you might need to do filling and things like that, we also don't want you to develop there. So there are some tensions. And of course, we've got the RMA reforms. So the MPSUD, what is it? It's basically high-level national direction in the form of what the government wants to achieve in terms of its objectives for urban development, and sets a range of policy that we must comply with. These national directions sit under the RMA, so they have a statutory weight that we have to comply with. The whole of the MPSUD applies to Tauranga, as we're one of, I think, 4 or 5 Tier 1 councils, basically the high growth areas. And as you know, the MPSUD has a lot of directive policy, particularly around intensification. So it was approved back in July by Cabinet. It came into effect on the 20th of August, so sort of 10 days ago. It replaces the national policy statement on urban development capacity, which had a much more narrow focus just on supply, rather than on the type of outcomes that we should be looking to achieve in our urban areas. And our Plan Change 26, Housing Choice, is looking to give effect to pretty much the MPSUD intensification requirements in full, and there is a requirement for all councils to give effect to those intensification requirements within 2 years. I think this is where you take over, Carl, to run through the next few slides.
Okay, yeah, so a significant part of the NPS urban development is around intensification and requiring that intensification to occur. Look, I think really the objectives and policies are based on what have become best practice principles for urban development and intensification, so they're not entirely new. A lot of what's in there has been learnt through, the Auckland plan, what's happening in Auckland and other areas moving forward. So there is a need to enable change over time and a need to provide for competitive land markets, so that they're always keeping that little bit of extra supply and growing upwards as well as outwards. I think you all know this quite well. In relation to Tier 1 urban environments, in particular Policy 3 and 4 in the NPS specific to the Tauranga context, enabling heights and density as much as possible around city centre zones. It also does talk to enabling height around metropolitan zones. Now, we don't have those currently, but as we work through the city plan review, that is a potential. Enabling 6+ stories within walkable range of the city centre, and also walkable catchments of existing and planned rapid transit stops. Now, for us, really, that is starting to look at, what does Cameron Road mean for us, and in terms of how it also links out to Tauranga and so forth. So just in terms of, I guess, just showing how this has played out for Te Papa, and I think really, as I say, this is generally based on best practice. So it was, and Janine and the team had been liaising with MFE and MHUD on this. So we sort of knew what was coming. We're quite very well aligned. So our city centre generally already meets Policy 3. It provides or maximises opportunity within the city centre, and based on plan change 26 and enabling that 6 stories within walking distance of the city centre, that will enable or meet the NPS requirements. Looking at, as we move down Cameron Road towards Greerton, we've identified indicative but likely locations for rapid transit stops, effectively around the key centres, Greerton, Gay Par, down towards the hospital and city centre. So we're able to map out walking distances from those locations, and again, we're providing 6 stories, generally providing 6 stories within those areas, unless there's a good reason not to. And again, that meets the intent of, or the policy of 3C of the NPS. Stepping a little bit further out from the catchments of, I guess, the hospital, city centre and Greerton in particular, we provide still providing higher density, but to that 4-storey heights, and again, this is in line with the NPS policy 3D. So overall, we're meeting the requirements of that. They do provide for areas of that can be exempt, subject to qualifying matters. So those are areas where you may have hazards, heritage. In our case, we're also responding to the view shafts, in relation to their cultural significance. So those are matters that will affect the heights within those areas. And as we work through the process, we'll ensure that that's acceptable, I guess. Yeah.
Take questions going through? Do you take questions now, or do you want to wait till the end?
It's not working. Should we just finish it off? There's just a few more slides and then we can take questions. So this brings us to then the car parking side of things. So here we have to remove anything in our district plan relating to minimum car parks. Basically, the idea is that developers will decide how much car parking to provide, and that relates to all development in all zones. It doesn't affect mobility parking though, which is good. So we can do that without going through a Schedule 1 plan change process, which is just an internal administrative process, and we can make those updates to our plan. And we're going to do that in November as discussed. Just in terms of responsiveness, the NPSUD is pretty keen, well, it's pretty directive on the fact that we need to be more responsive in our planning, and particularly in relation to considering private plan changes, whether they be in greenfield areas, brownfield areas, or I guess greyfield areas, anywhere in our city, where they involve significant additional development capacity, and that is not defined, but I understand there's some guidance that will be drafted around some of these matters, where they achieve good outcomes, so things like public transport, ensuring like wetlands and rivers are protected, that type of thing, and where they're well connected with other transport corridors as well. There's also provision there around considering housing affordability and climate change as key matters going forward around our urban development. In terms of the more strategic planning side of things, it's really a rollover of what's in the NPS urban development capacity at the moment, or up until now. So we have to undertake what are called housing and business capacity assessments. And that's basically a stock take of how much development capacity have we got in our city for housing and for business over different time periods, looking forward over 3, 10 and 30 years, comparing that against to how much capacity we need, adding in the various margins that are required to ensure competitive markets, and considering matters not just whether it's zoned, but when will the infrastructure capacity be available? Is it commercially feasible, i.e. profitable to deliver? And how much of it's likely to get taken up by the development market? So just because something's feasible doesn't mean it will get built. Often only a percentage of what is enabled to be developed will get delivered over any sort of particular time frame. So we need to continue doing that work. We need to do our next housing and business capacity assessment by 1 July next year, but it's the housing component only. And then that progresses into what's called the future development strategy, which is about how we respond to our housing and business needs, and that will really look to be a review of the previous one we did, and I'm probably incorporating UFD into that, into a single document that has both a 30 and a 100-year time frame. Our same requirements around monitoring still exist. Most of the monitoring is done by Ave Greenway, who many of you will know, and Jane, who sits with Ave, and that's monitoring housing prices, housing costs, business land available, all those sorts of matters that come through our development trends and quarterly monitoring reports. And those we need to publish as well. There's a real focus as well on having evidence, strong evidence basis for our decision making. You'll see this come through our plan changes, and particularly in the Section 32 evaluation reports, of which are many hundreds of pages long, with evidence and evaluation of the options that we're looking to take, and also significant focus going forward on engagement with stakeholders and particularly our partners in terms of tangata whenua. This here, and this might respond a little bit to comments that have been made today, this is a one-pager effectively of everything that is the NPS UD produced by the Ministry for the Environment, and this is a sort of the potential type of tool we could use to communicate on one page with our community if we wanted to use something like this. But this doesn't really have anything in addition to what I've said, but this is capturing it all in one place. So that is the NPS UD in a nutshell, and that's the end of this presentation.
Thank you, Andy. So I think there was a question from Councillor Hughes and Councillor Robson.
Thanks. Yeah, just a quick question on the zones you were showing. It showed, so there's no changes, because Merivale was, I thought it was 3 stories that we were going up to, Merivale and Gate Park, but on this one it says 6 and 4 stories. Does that mean that we have changed what we're doing, or?
No, Side note. So based on the discussion that we had in the last resolutions, so within the white areas shown on the map, they'll still be subject to Plan Change 26.
Right.
And there'll still be that increase in housing choice and density through those areas up to a maximum of 9 metres or 3 stories.
Oh, I see. Sorry, I was looking further up.
Yeah,
Nice.
the Maryvale area is just right here. Yeah.
Councillor Robson, then Councillor Clout.
Yeah, you picked up part of it as you went through, which is the enabling doesn't mean it happens. And I think that's critical in here. The thing I'm interested in, when is the first report due? When would you anticipate delivering that first report, which basically says, this is your capacity, this is what's actually happening, that whole, because the market, we don't have control over, neither does central government. The market are major players in the outcomes of what we enable, so that outcome delivery's got the market in there. When does that first report drop?
So we've been monitoring this for 10 plus years. We
Yep.
release reports on a quarterly basis.
Based on this though, this has got a different level of granularity in terms of information.
The requirements around reporting are pretty similar, largely been rolled over from what was required in the past. There's a little bit of extra detail, sure, yes, but we can provide a lot of detail in the past of what's happening, and we'll just keep that current and carrying over. As we know, for an example, there's been a huge amount of intensification capacity zoned in the city centre for many decades, and very little of it has been taken up to date. So that's an example where perhaps the development feasibility hasn't aligned with what's plan enabled. Over time that's changing, and changing in a positive way, and we're seeing more of that development, but it is going to take time.
Sorry, just in terms of the report, the supplementary is that statement that you just made hasn't come through strongly in previous reporting. My feeling is there is a change of emphasis. They are looking for evidence that the enabling is delivering and the commercial considerations are being addressed. Will that put pressure on us to subsidise development in places?
I don't believe there's the subsidisation issue is there, but what's happening is for our planning zones we have to set a purpose for it. So for example, in our 6-storey zone we might set a purpose of medium to high density, apartment development as, with good design outcomes. Then we have to monitor that, and if it's not happening, then we have to go back and consider why it's not happening. So we go back and revisit our planning rules and say, are they the problem? Or we look at other things. Is it infrastructure? Is it the fact that there's no money to be made in it? Like it costs too much to build these things? So we look at a range of, issues, options and solutions there. Some of it might involve us changing our planning rules, but there's not a requirement, and they cannot mandate under the RMA for us to spend money through our long-term plan, our annual plan, under the LGA.
Thank you.
Councillor Clout.
Thank you. Under the previous NPS urban development capacity, we had very much mandatory targets of, zoned land, etc. Now, are those mandatory targets still in this new NPS, or have they dropped that?
Those still remain, and they are unchanged. They have targets across the 3, 10 and 30-year timeframes, and you have to provide a buffer. So in the first 10 years it's a 20% buffer, and in the long term 15% in addition. So yes, that remains.
Okay. Can we have copies of the presentation there, and particularly that one with all of what's in the MPSUD in that one pager? Is it already in, Stella? All right. Okay, thank you. That one pager might be useful as a separate, A3 size, so we can carry it with us in our little satchels, so we can use it with public engagement, perhaps.
Yeah, I'm sure we could find the link to that and send it through so you can print it. Yeah.
Workshop, that's all right, we'll do so. We'll stay here, then we don't have to move the screen and other things.